Alrighty, yeah. So welcome everyone to the Neptune Triton System Seminar Series. Today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Mandy Bethkenhagen. So Dr. Mandy Bethkenhagen received her PhD from the University of Rostock and worked briefly as a postdoc at Lawrence Livermore National Lab before returning to her alma mater for a postdoc position. She's currently a Marie Curie Fellow at ENS Lyon in Lyon Geology Laboratory for Earth, Planets, and Environments. She's developing molecular dynamic simulations and a new equation of state to constrain the rock-ice ratio in planetary interior models, which will allow for the exploration of interfaces between the inner mantle and the core of ice giant planets on an atomic level. So thank you so much for joining us, Mandy, and thank you all in the audience for joining. For Q&A, you can save your questions for the end. You can unmute yourself and just kind of chime in, or you can post things in the chat and Mandy can answer them right then or save them for later. So it's a pretty informal seminar series. So don't feel shy or hesitant to unmute yourself to ask any questions. So I'll turn it over to you, Mandy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jody. Thanks for the nice introduction. And first of all, for inviting me to the Super Nice Seminar Series. I'm really happy to be here today. And as Jody already said, I'm working on atomistic simulations. And today I'm going to talk about what we can actually learn from them, as well as from shock compression experiment in order to understand better the interior of Uranus and Neptune. Well, and before I actually jump into this, I just want to make sure I'm acknowledging all the people that contributed to parts of my presentation I'm gonna be showing today. And this is, of course, a lot of other simulation people, but also some planetary modeling people, like, for example, Nadine Nettelmann. And then there's lots and lots of experimental people that actually pulled off all these shock compression experiments I really want to thank. So let's jump in what we want to look at today. Well, I guess in this audience here, everybody is very familiar with Uranus and Neptune. And I always like to show this picture first, because to me, it's kind of impressive then to look at these photos, because they're kind of old. Well, the Voyager 2 mission, it's a little bit of time ago. And I'm always happy to say that actually the picture of Uranus is like as old as myself. So I really hope that soon some other mission will go there and to look again at these findings, because, for example, the magnetic fields the magnetic fields Voyager 2 detected, they're kind of peculiar, especially when we compare them to other planetary magnetic fields. So while, for example, the Earth's magnetic fields, or also the ones of Mercury and Saturn, look almost perfectly dipolar, the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune have a really unusual magnetic field structure. In particular, they are very non-axisymmetric and are very dominated by higher orders. So people have been wondering, so what's up with this magnetic field? Is it maybe related to something in the interior structure? And how can we understand this in terms of the formation and evolution models for these planets? So what I want to look at is, of course, the interior structure. So just to give everybody a quick heads up how these interiors are usually calculated. So basically, we take all the observational constraints we know from missions, either from ground-based observations or also from missions like Voyager 2. So basically, we have the mass, the radius, then the rotation period, or the surface temperature. And then depending on what kind of planet, we also have like gravitational moments to a particular order, or then also the surface and the mean composition. And we basically have these two equations here we're using to calculate the interior. And the main input is the number of layers we want to simulate. And then another important input is the equation of state, which is what I'm going to be looking at today. And just before I forget to mention, another important constraint is that we put in this linear mixing approximation, because as you might know, there's a lot of different materials inside these planets. And since we don't really know all the different mixtures and how they behave, we actually just look at the pure materials and try to then linearly combine them. So when I think about an ice giant planet, I actually see it mostly like that. So I always think about it in terms of what kind of atoms and where to find them. And we have basically three different parts. So we have an outer mantle, which is dominated by hydrogen and helium. Then we have an inner mantle, which is dominated by water, ammonia, and methane, where water is the most dominating part. And then we have a core, which is full of magnesium oxide or also silicates or iron, for example, where people really take a lot of different equations of state. And the thing we want to focus on is basically how this all connects to this magnetic field structure. And here on the right, I'm just showing a schematic Christa Soderlund kindly gave me once. So basically, we want to know in which region in the planet is actually the dynamo formed. And as you can see here on the right, it's strongly believed that this is done in the deep interior. So the layer we're really mostly interested is here, this inner mantle, which is full of this water, ammonia, methane mixture. So what people mostly do, and well, they have done this in the past, I don't know, for the last decades when they modeled Uranus and Neptune, they basically simplify this layer by just saying, okay, let's just have a look at water and its properties first. So here I'm showing basically a simplified phase diagram view of water. So the three states we can have water in the interior is basically fluid, which I'm showing on the left, or you could also think of a solid. So for example, here I'm showing the ice tent structure. And then there is a phase which is thought to be believed to the magnetic field structure. This is the superionic phase. What is that? So basically it's a lattice of a heavy oxygen ions, and then we have a hydrogen ions almost freely diffusing through that. This is the kind of funny state of matter, which doesn't really occur in a lot of systems. Usually it is found in systems that have a large charge transfer. And what's particularly important here is the high ionic conductivity, because in order to create a dynamo action, we need some conducting material that at the same time has a high conductivity. And that's why we're so interested in the properties of this phase. Today I brought you a little video of what this actually looks like. So I invite you all to look at this little animation here on the right. And I want to point out to focus on this little cyan atom, which is actually an enhanced hydrogen atom. So all the other ones are in gray and oxygen atoms are in red. And then this one, we want to see how this one is moving. So let's check this out. So you can basically see that we have this cyan atom moving from different oxygen sites and moving around in between oxygen sites. And if the video might have been a little bit too quick, I try to do a little schematic of what was happening here. So basically we see in these four red circuits here, we see that the oxygen ions are vibrating there on their fixed lattice positions. And then this hydrogen atom, it basically jumped in between these four sites. And this is exactly what the superionic phase is about. These hydrogen ions, they don't just have this one oxygen ion, they really have this diffusive process where they really change their bonding partners really very frequently. So how are we actually simulating that? So the basics of that is molecular dynamics, which is a technique which has been known for a long time, and where basically we describe the motion of the ions with Newtonian dynamics. And then on top of this, we also consider the electron density. So we look at density functional theory, which basically describes the Schrödinger equation in a little bit numerically more simple terms. So instead of the wave function, we look at the electronic density. And the only real approximation we make here is this exchange correlation function. So on the right, I try to make a little scheme how this simulation goes. So basically, we always start with some ion positions in the molecular dynamics step. And then we basically self-consistently vary the electronic density and the states until we find a free energy minimum. And we have found that we move the ions and we continue with our trajectory. These simulations can be typically done for 100 to 1,000 atoms, just to give you an idea of how many we can consider. Okay, so why are we doing this kind of, well, a costly and intense simulation scheme? Well, what we're looking at here is actually kind of compressed states. So we look at systems with up to 10-fold compression, and also the temperatures are pretty elevated with a couple of thousand kelvins. We have strong correlations. We have all kinds of metallization, ionization, and dissociation processes. We really need to look at the electronic density as well. And then what we typically get out of these simulations are equations of state, structure, transport, and also optical properties, for example, like opacity or reflectivity. Okay, so one of the key results we can then get is the phase diagram. And here I'm showing a result of Martin French from University of Rostock. And you can see here the basic phases which are important for Uranus and Neptune. So Uranus, the isentrope is shown in gray, and in black we see the one of Neptune. And on the right, I'm showing some models for these planets. So they are adiabatic, which correspond to this. So we see here that it actually crosses from molecular to the ionic over to the superionic phase. And what is always shown for both of these models on the left are actually magnetic dynamo simulations of Sabine Stanley, where you see that they seem to kind of nicely agree with this, with the interior structure. So for example, you find a convecting region exactly where we have actually the ionic water. So there it seems that there's the very high conductivity where we can still have convective motion, and then the superionic water below that region is basically just supporting the dynamo region. So basically there we have a system which is non-convecting anymore. So what's the problem now? Why were we not happy at the time with these models we got? Well, if you then also look at the evolution of these planets, you can see, for example, for Uranus, that when you calculate actually the time it took for the planet to cool down, you see that we're not arriving at today's age, but we really overestimate the cooling time. So actually, Uranus has a way too low luminosity. And what can we do about it? Well, there's a coupling modeling directions we can take. For example, we can also look at other planetary ices like ammonia and methane. Maybe we can mix in some rocks. Or what Nadine Nettelman suggested a couple of years ago is to actually introduce this thermal boundary layer to look at non-adiabatic models. So it's basically an artificial temperature jump between outer and inner layer, where we can then match the luminosity of Uranus. And this can be done for Neptune, of course, as well. You can actually do it for both planets a little bit differently to match the age of the planets correctly. So what I want to talk about today are basically these 4 points. And I don't know if I take a little bit too long, I might actually stop somewhere, maybe after point number 3. So I first want to look at how we can maybe improve our water results. Then what can we actually do for ammonia? And is it even important to include ammonia? Then third, I'm going to look at methane. And fourth, I'm going to discuss a little bit the role of rocks in this whole equation here. Okay, so let's start with water. How can we actually improve? So to start you off a little bit, I just want to quickly talk about high pressure experiments. So one thing we can do is, are the so-called static experiments, which can be done in diamond anvil cells, which I'm showing here schematically. And basically it's like a tiny press. So you have in the middle your sample, and you usually have a pressure indicator like a ruby, for example, where you can then gauge your pressure. And then you basically just apply some force on the diamond. So you really just mechanically press it. And what usually works very nicely for these kind of experiments, you get the phase diagrams to a pretty high accuracy. For example, here in red, I'm showing the experimental melting curve, which agrees very nicely for water here with the black calculated ab initio simulation. So usually these experiments, they're very accurate, but typically they can only be done up to about 300 gigapascals. That's why we also do shock compression experiments. And shock compression experiments, basically, we fill in the material we want to investigate into a container like this. And then we put a laser on this. And with the laser, we induce a shock compression wave. And then we have a couple instruments we can use to identify, for example, the temperature by measuring the gray body radiation. or when we can have a reflectometer to get the conductivity and reflectivity. And we have a visor to get the shock velocity, which we can translate with the Hugonot relation down here into pressure, where we relate always the initial states, which are given by the 0 to the final shock state, which is indicated by 1. So what's the problem here? So if we just use the Hugonot actually and just compress, we really quickly run into a state that is very hot and not very dense. So actually we fail a little bit in reaching Neptune and Uranus conditions. So what we prefer to do is double shocks or triple shocks, or even better to do, for example, ramp compressions, which is this quasi-isentrope here. Or what we can also do, we combine the shock compression together with the diamond anvil cells to actually start from a different pre-compression, and like that we can reach Neptune as well. And this is what we have done here. But before I talk about ammonia experiments, where I'm gonna quickly show results for, I first want to talk about water. So here, this is an experiment of Marius Meo and Federica Copari from Livermore. And here, was one of the experiments which really convincingly showed that they reached the superionic phase. And they used actually different methods. So they used the uncompressed Hugonot here in gray, and then Hugonot, which was slightly compressed with an initial density of 1.6 grams per cubic centimeter. And there you can see nicely that they actually reach here in the superionic region. And here you see exactly the melting plateau, and then they go out of this phase again. And here on right hand side, you can quickly see that the total conductivity of this Hugonot here in blue is much higher than the conductivity of an uncompressed Hugonot in black. So this is a nice proof that we can actually reach the superionic phase with these kind of experiments. And then also in the second campaign, they could also show that they even, including X-ray diffraction, they could even differentiate between a face-centered cubic and a body-centered cubic, so FCC and BCC structure for the oxygen ions, where the red symbols here always indicate the FCC results, and the blue ones the BCC results. So this is really some nice experimental work, and I really encourage you to read these papers. This transition was actually already predicted years before by Burkhard Militzer and Hugh Wilson. And I'm showing here, for example, that they actually indicated that the structure of superionic water might actually change the melting behavior. And that's why everybody is interested in looking at these different structures. But a lot of these ab initio simulations actually contradicted each other. And that's why we looked at this again with another method. So what I didn't say before when I talked about the density functional theory calculations is that they're actually very costly because of the DFT part. And we would like to do this a little bit differently, to also go to higher system sizes and longer simulations. And for example, to get entropy consistently out of these simulations. And to do that, it's a machine learning approach, which here was done by Bingqing Cheng. So we can basically go from atoms systems of like with 100 to 1,000 atoms to up to 20,000 atoms in this case here. And then we can get also quantities like the entropy, ionic conductivity, and can also study like the mixing effects and interface effects. So for example, for superionic water, we have here a two-phase simulation where we have in the middle superionic water, and then we have liquid water on both sides. And here you can, for example, then study the hydrogen ions crossing the boundary of both phases. And like that, you can also study the stability region of different phases. So when we combine this, for example, also with looking at diffusion coefficients here on the right, and here also the diffuse behavior of hydrogen atoms in different at different conditions, we see that we can really study now with this machine learning potentials for very big systems the phase diagram self-consistently. And this is basically the last phase diagram of water, which we think is now what we should be using. So here we see that we basically have FCC water, superionic water. So every time we see a red region, it means that the FCC is the thermodynamically stable region, whereas in blue, the BCC region is stable. And if I just want to point out here for the Uranus and Neptune isentropes, you see that actually the most important thing is the melting line, which actually does not differ for BCC and FCC. So it's actually contradicting the previous DFT findings, and the underlying structure of the oxygen lattice does not really matter too much. Okay, so how important is it now to consider ammonia for these planets? Because ammonia is actually not very abundant in Uranus and Neptune. It's just about 8% in the icy layers. But still, it has some really interesting differences compared to water, and that's why I think we should study it. So this here on the left is the latest diamond anvil cell phase diagram for ammonia, where you can see they kind of stopped before reaching the Superionic region here for the melting line. And then there was recently proposed a second diamond anvil cell phase diagram, where you can see that there's a second Superionic phase on top here. So this led us to study the Superionic phase of ammonia also with shock compression experiments. And as I said before, we combined this with some diamond anvil cell to actually introduce some pre-compressions, what it does. So if I don't pre-compress ammonia, I can only reach basically this red path here along the Hugonio. But now if I introduce some different pre-compressions, as you can see here with different colors, we are able to reach the Superionic part, at least theoretically. So let's see if we can also do that in the experiment. So first of all, we check, of course, that the equation of state data and then also the reflectivities that were measured, if they agree well with the DFT-MD data. So here on the left, all the solid lines are DFT predictions, and then the points are, the big and the small ones are points for different pre-compressions for ammonia for the equation of state. And then on the right, it's the reflectivity at two different wavelengths. And there you see the symbols are DFT, and then the solid lines are the experimental averages. And you see they actually agree very nicely too. So when we try to derive the melting curve also from this combined effort of experiment and theory, and you see here the experimental shots for 4 different pre-compressions. So here you see the almost uncompressed shot that's in red, and then with even higher compression is the green and the blue ones. And here you see this little plateau, and this is what we interpret in the experiment as melting. So when we combine this with some DFT-MD simulations, which were anchored here in these purple points, so here, and then also we have an expansion simulation here. So then from this, we derive now the melting curve from ammonia for the first time from a combined effort of experiments and DFT. We can also then infer the electrical conductivity by translating the reflectivity into the conductivity using DFT. And I'm showing here, every time I'm showing circuits, it's ammonia, and if it's the squares, it's water. And the color code is the electronic contribution of the conductivity. And you see the water data, it basically always stays in this region between 0 and, let's say, maybe a little bit more than 1,000 Siemens per centimeter, whereas ammonia really increases much, much stronger. So we're concluding that we actually find a lot of higher conductivity in ammonia than in water. So for the adiabatic models, for example, we find that the conductivity is not that different, but the melting line slope is very different in the different materials. So here, for example, in ammonia compared to water and red. And for the non-adiabatic Uranus model, which I'm showing up here, which goes up to 12,000 Kelvin, you can see that the conductivity of ammonia is up to an order of magnitude larger than in water. So that might be interesting for people modeling magnetic dynamos. And just one thing to keep in mind, in the Superionic phase, it's actually the hydrogen atoms, the hydrogen ions, that are the major contributor for the electrical conductivity, while in the metallic regime, it's the electrons that do the dominant contribution. Okay, so one thing I didn't mention on the plot before, but you can also then study other mixtures. So for example, here I'm showing ammonia, an ammonia hydrate. So it's ammonia hemihydrate. So I just say for short AHH. And this is a 2-to-1 ammonia water mixture. And this has even more interesting phase behavior. So for example, here in this region, it has this excited regime where you can get all kinds of different atomic motions, which is in between, again, a solid and superionic. And then most interestingly, you can also have lattices where you have on different sides of the BCC structure a 50-50% chance of finding either a nitrogen or an oxygen atom. So actually, there might not just be superionic water next to superionic ammonia. Maybe it's actually just regions where these atoms are just like at really randomly distributed sites, and it's just a mixture of the two. You can then also calculate, this was done by Victor Naden Robinson actually in Edinburgh. You can then calculate for different compositions of water and ammonia, different phase diagrams. And you can see if you always plot Uranus and Neptune in these diagrams, you see that the melting line really strongly depends on the ammonia content. So it's really important to determine where exactly in the mantle of Uranus and Neptune ammonia might be enriched. Maybe there's even an ammonia-rich layer. So what do we know about methane? And I guess I can do this part pretty quickly because I'm starting to run out of time. So hydrocarbons actually do not form superionic phases, as for example here demonstrated for polystyrene, which is C8H8 of the work of Dominic Krauss. Instead, you can see that they polymerize, and at some pressures you find them actually to demix into diamond and hydrogen. So this is a really different process, and it's completely not understood how this actually works in conjunction with superionic phases. So basically you always get at a certain pressure at under about, let's say 3500 Kelvin, you always get diamond plus hydrogen rather than methane. So just here to show you again a little video. You see, if you set this up like that, if you build basically a diamond lattice and then you put the hydrogen next to them, they really cannot penetrate this kind of lattice. So you can really see that they don't like to mix. But I should also mention that these simulations are very imperfect. So if I would start that differently, I can actually force to mix them and to break the diamond. So actually it's still ongoing work to figure out how to really describe this system. And we actually hope that the machine learning potentials will help us here. So just to quickly summarize this water, ammonia, methane part. So basically you can construct very different models using these three equations of state for the inner part or for the inner mantle. And you can have a very cold model, which is only up to about 4000 Kelvin in the interior, or you can introduce a thermal boundary layer, and then you can get models which are up to 14,000 Kelvin higher in temperature. And really depending on the model, it either crosses these boundaries, and also these boundaries here for superionic ammonia and methane actually, they are really still a little bit under debate. For example, the superionic ammonia melting line I showed earlier, it's probably a little bit higher than this. So it really depends on the simulations, and it's really important to combine these models directly with our simulations outcomes, I think. So then I promised in a little small part, if I still have time, otherwise Jodie, please stop me.
No, you're great. Yeah, go on.
Okay, so just a quick little outlook. So are superionic phases actually now stable to the addition of rocky material? I guess this is the question everybody is targeting now. And there was this really nice work of Alona Vazan and Ravid Held lately. And they looked at the Uranus models with a compositional gradient rather than with a thermal boundary layer. So what they did is they actually considered ice and rock in the interior, and Z, it's the content of all these metal components. So everything that's not hydrogen and helium is here metal, so it contributes to Z. And on the upper panels, for 4 different Uranus models, you always see this metal contribution. And in the lower part, you always see the temperature profile. And it's always a cross-evolution of the planet. And you can see from a 2-layer model, which basically has only ice, to a model which is very rock-rich on the right, you basically find a whole bunch of possibilities how you can model this without actually introducing a thermal boundary layer. And well, as I said, hopefully earlier, the constraints of a planet are still so loose that all of them are possibilities. So we cannot really decide which one is the best. So it would be very great to have some additional input here. And I think what we need to do for that is to do some additional DFT-MD simulations. And this is basically what I'm trying to do currently. but it's still work in progress. So basically we're trying to have interfaces of solids and superionic water, for example, and then to get equation of state data and electrical conductivity to hopefully make a contribution to find out what's like the most likely scenario if we have really a very differentiated planet, or if we have planets that are actually more gradual in composition, like here shown in the case D. And there's actually been some work already of other groups. And I just want to show you quickly. So for example, here, people set up an HCP phase of iron, and then they introduce some interstitials of hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And they always find a superionic phase. So always, every blue region here for all these three different compositions, there's always a superionic phase. And also additionally, I should mention there's also some other work which was recently published. It's like the superionic FeO mixtures that have also some hydrogen in them. So apparently it's pretty easy to still make a superionic phase if you have a rocky material. So this was also shown for silicate plus hydrogen, or silicate plus water. And also here in this cyan region here, you still find superionic regions, which would then here on the right. So it's actually here in the core where you then would have the superionic mixtures. So this is pretty interesting. So people are looking at this now. So if actually cores can be superionic too instead of normally solid, that's definitely something we should check out more. But I think what these two studies I just shown miss a little bit is to really investigate if these phases are actually thermodynamically stable, because I mean, they dynamically get that they are superionic, but I think there's still some thermodynamics missing to be done. Okay, so just to summarize quickly, I think it's still challenging to construct nice Uranus and Neptune models, because there's not enough observational constraints for the moment. And especially to describe both planets on the same level of theory seems to be a rather big challenge. So what seems to work for one planet doesn't necessarily give a good planetary model for the other one. So there's really some work that needs to be more done. And hopefully I could convince you that these ab initio simulations and also experiments could actually be a nice addition, and maybe at least give some ideas of how planetary models could be altered. So, and with this, I just quickly leave you with some questions I think we should address in the future, at least from the simulation point of view, where we should really try to see if there is a core at all in Uranus and Neptune. For example, maybe there's really instead a superionic core, or do we just in general have a fluid of, for example, ice rock mixture? And with that, I want to thank you for your attention.
Yeah, I'm trying to do the clap emoji, sort of the reaction. Thank you so much, Mandy. That was incredible. It was really cool to see the animation that you had of the sort of demixed methane where the hydrogen and the carbon just weren't mixing. That was really cool to see. I've never kind of pictured that in my head before. So that was incredible. So yeah, we can sort of open up the floor to questions. Again, this is a pretty informal seminar series. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. You could use the raise hand feature. That's it's one of the reactions on the bottom of your like Zoom panel. Or you can, or if you're a little shy, you can kind of post it in the chat and I can read for you. So any of those will work. I'll kind of start things off while people are formulating their questions. So I'm curious, so as I'm sure we're all aware, the decadal survey is coming out next week, actually a week from today. And I'm super stoked about it. And I think we all kind of have our like fingers crossed that there is going to be, something like a Neptune or a Uranus orbiter of some sort. So I'm curious, what types of measurements from something like a Neptune or a Uranus orbiter would you need to maybe better constrain some of these models, or maybe even just outright answer some of these outstanding questions that you have?
Well, I mean, I think for Uranus and Neptune, the gravitational moments are still pretty unconstrained. So that's, I think, a no-brainer, right? Even though they mostly help us only on the outer part of the planet. But I mean, for example, all these thermal boundary layers, for example, they're still pretty far outside in the planet. So I think maybe for that it could help. And then it would be, of course, be nice again to look at also the atmosphere and the surface composition a little bit again. For example, I'm also thinking about doing H2S right now, because that's actually the material I think people have not really done too much so far. So that's, for example, something to understand how this really behaves differently to water. So for that, it would be nice to have some measurements also of the surface composition again. But I guess you guys are more the experts on that, of what else to measure. So this is just what I think what would be nice.
Yeah, and if anyone in the audience has their own thoughts of what they would want, I'd love to hear them. Feel free to unmute yourself. I'll also pause for a second for if folks want to.
Well, hey Mandy, this is Mark Hofstetter at JPL. I just loved it when you said you want to look at H2S, so I'll endorse that. And just to make sure I've understood what you've presented today. So as you probably know, when we look at the atmosphere of Uranus and Neptune, we see it's really rich in methane, it's strongly depleted in ammonia, and it's depleted, hydrogen sulfide is depleted, but not as much as ammonia is depleted. And so I wanted to understand when you were talking about what phases mix with the superionic phases. So is it correct that the enrichment of methane in the atmosphere and the depletion of ammonia in the atmosphere could be explained by the ammonia being trapped in this superionic water or other phases in the interior? Is that correct?
I would say it's kind of speculative, right? Because I mean, what happens to methane is, like, I would say this is like the biggest question, like for these three pure ices, because technically at the high pressures, it should really decompose. Like, I think, like, looking at all the experiments Dominic Krauss has done on so many different plastics right now, it really looks like methane is not stable at these at like the high pressures and should really decompose into carbon and hydrogen. But of course, if some of the methane is in the outer part, right? So as soon as methane is like in pressure lower than, let's say, 100 GPa and in temperature not too hot, it should still be there. So yeah, you could really think that like the upper part methane could be still intact, and that's why it's detected. While actually, it's a kind of nice interpretation. I didn't think about that too much. That's a great suggestion, Mark. Thank you. So that the ammonia could really be trapped because it likes to mix so well with water. And also there was some recent work by Andreas Hermann and Lewis Conway in Edinburgh, I think. So they showed that also ammonia and H2S, they like to mix very well and can form like H2S ammonia rich layers. So yeah, maybe that's actually the reason they form superionic phases there, while the methane really has to do something chemically different, where I'm afraid we don't have the final answer where exactly most of the amount is.
Yeah. Well, if that idea pans out, then what we would predict based on what we see in the atmosphere is the hydrogen sulfide is intermediate to the methane and the ammonia in how likely it is to be sequestered down in the deep interior. Yeah,
that's true. And I think, I actually did some literature research recently on the H2S. There's a lot of work on H3S, which is superconducting. But there's actually not too much about like high pressure, high temperature H2S. And my gut feeling is it should behave like H2O. So, but it's interesting. So especially like also looking how it would behave with water. So that's really something we need to look at. So I'm happy you say that this is something you'd be interested as well.
Yes, absolutely. It's great. Very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, then there was a comment.
Hi, Mandy.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This is Corey, also from JPL. Great talk. I actually come from a background of quantum mechanics, actually. So very familiar with the DFT approach. However, a lot of my background was in understanding these in semiconductors, using these simulations where boundary conditions were definitely criticized at that level. I guess my question is, you've made some advances in moving the DFT volume size up to, I think I saw 20,000 different atoms. I guess, can you say anything about your boundary conditions and, you know, going to a planetary scale? What's involved in that? I think I might have missed that.
Well, I didn't say it, so thank you. It's a great comment. So actually, it's just periodic boundary conditions. So, you know, if the particles fly out on one side, they come just back on the other part. So that's why you always want to make sure you really simulate a big enough chunk of a material, because otherwise you can get some self-interactions of the atoms with itself. So you really want to make sure you have a big enough system to get all the interactions correct. Yeah, and I mean, you can even go higher than 20,000 atoms. It's just basically what Bing-Ching and us basically did for water, but I'm pretty sure like basically on the computer size, you can go even to like 100,000 atoms, maybe even more.
Okay, thank you, Mandy. Appreciate it, and nice work. I really glad to see this approach being taken here in planetary science.
Thank you.
This is Mark again, if I may kind of follow up on something Corey said. I haven't done any machine learning kind of work, but the fact that your machine learning worked on this small cluster of atoms, the 100 to 1,000, is there any concern that it is missing some long-range physics that happens, that you know, by machine learning on the small systems, you might be missing something that happens when you expand to 100,000 molecules?
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course, the data is only as good as the data you put in, right? So we're also like checking, for example, for different functionals, and then also for quantum effects. So also like there's also some path integral molecular dynamics to check for quantum effects. And actually, when we construct the training set, we also take actually different sizes into account. So we go to smaller to bigger. But I mean, there's kind of a limit of what we can do. So of course, there's always a concern that we're missing something. But since all the projects that have been done, and this was really led by Bing-Ching Cheng, right? So she did a lot of systems already, and she compared also for hydrogen and a lot of water, actually, a lot of water projects. So it seems to really work nicely compared to experiments. So far, like given like the experimental accuracy, I think the results are stunning so far. So this seems really the direction to go we want to take.
Yeah, well, that is reassuring.
Yeah, thank you.
And I know for folks that watch the recording, I don't think they can see the chat, so I'll voice what was in the chat. So Mark Elowitz said, in response to the question that I had for Mandy about the type of measurements you would want like a Neptune or Uranus orbiter to take to help with this, these models. Mark said, send a probe into the atmosphere of Neptune during the mission to measure the upper atmospheric layers. Yes, definitely. Like, I think I can maybe see it in my background. Like, yeah, any other questions that people want to throw out? You can put it in the chat. I can read it for you, or you can unmute yourselves. While I'm waiting, I'll ask one more question. I had, and this is my naivety of not being in the sort of ice giant field, or really gas giant field. I usually do more solid objects, but for one of the first slides that you sort of had this sort of family portrait of magnetic fields across the solar system, and I think all of the gas giants, or all of the giants except for Saturn, had a pretty unusual structure of magnetic fields. I think Saturn was very, very linear, almost like I think Mercury, but maybe inverted. Is there a reason that Saturn is so different? Is it somehow being influenced by its rings, or is it just sort of a random outlier?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm not at all a Saturn expert, right? So this is really something I guess we would need to ask Krista or Sabine, right? But I mean, Saturn is really like, at least like from the interior point of view, I can say that Saturn is really much more influenced by the hydrogen-helium demixing and the materialization of hydrogen. So it's really different physical processes that are important in Jupiter and Saturn than compared to Uranus and Neptune. So like there's really people, what I'm basically doing for the ice giants, they do the exact same thing for focusing more on hydrogen, helium rich mixtures to look at demixing processes, how these things metallize and so on. So maybe there's a good answer from that, but I feel like I'm not really qualified to say how this really acts on the magnetic field here.
Okay.
But I think it has been bothering people that Saturn looks so extremely dipolar, right? Because it's really amazing how much it looks dipolar.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I hope Krista sees this later and has a good answer.
And then, right, there's a question in the chat from Jim Friedson. Any implications for noble gas abundances in the atmosphere?
Yes, that's actually a good point. So actually, there was also a lot of work recently on like superionic phases that include helium. So basically, what we do is like if we have no idea what kind of structures to put, we do some structure searching. So basically, we randomly put atoms in the box. So we give some compositions, and then we basically put them randomly in a box, look at different compositions, different crystal structures, and then look which of them are stable. And then the most stable ones, thermodynamically, we take them and heat them up. And then people did that also for water helium and for ammonia helium, and they found that also these things are superionic. But to be honest, I have a little bit of doubts there, because I think if systems want to demix, they could also look superionic, because technically in our simulations we don't have gravity, right? So we wouldn't really be able to judge if these things would just like to flow out, but they're kind of trapped, so they have to be superionic. So that's why it's important when people claim something superionic, we also need to look at thermodynamics. And I think this was so hard in the past because we couldn't really get entropy for a lot of systems very accurately. So now with the machine learning potentials, I think that's something that should be better. But long story short, people have seen superionic materials that have noble gases in them, but we just started doing that. So for example, people didn't do that with neon or krypton as far as I'm aware. So I cannot really say there's a general trend, but I think this is something people are starting to look into.
Great. Any last minute questions? I'll pause for a few seconds.
Well, this is Marking, and I'll just say, that comment about noble gases is critical. So if you want to start looking at the heavier noble gases, that's important too, because we always say when we measure the argon, krypton, xenon in the atmosphere, that's representative of the bulk of the planet. And if you can sequester noble gases in the interior somehow, that changes how we interpret probe data entirely.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think actually there's also, I forgot to mention, but I think also Burkhard Militzer did a little bit of work on that. I think he for sure worked also like looking at some demixing of neon, I think, but more like for the giant, for like the gas giants. But yeah, for sure, this is not very extensively done for all the noble gases. So that's really maybe something our field is not aware of to really look at. So it's a great idea to do that.
Alrighty, yeah. Well, if there aren't any more, we can kind of move to the sort of community news part. So every time we have one of these Neptune Triton Seminar Series, I've got sort of a slide that I update with kind of community news, things that are going on in the field that I think people would be interested in this group. So I'll just real quick kind of flash that up, and I think let's see if hopefully everyone can see that. So and I'll post all of these. By the way, I'll post all of these in the chat in just a second, so that you can kind of see so that you can see the links, or you can click on the links at least. So Right. So I mentioned this at the very beginning. So the next Neptune Triton System Seminar Series is going to occur May 10th. It'll be Dr. Nick Teamby, and you can register at that link. Again, I'll post it in the chat in just a second. I think one of the biggest pieces of news that's happening is that the decadal survey is coming out next week. Super excited about that. I think there's maybe like an in-person release, but there's a Zoom version of it too, I believe, or in some way a webcast or a stream at that link. And I want to say it's something like 2 p.m. Eastern, or it's sometime in the afternoon, at least in the States here. And then let's see, there's a few meetings related to kind of giant planets. So there's the in situ exploration of the giant planets workshop. Abstracts are due pretty soon, a couple weeks. And then OPAG, the Outer Planets Assessment Group, registration is also coming up there. And I just want to mention there's early career travel stipends for folks if you need a little bit of help with kind of maybe the registration costs or travel. And then there's a few postdoc openings that I wanted to plug for early career folks. Sorry, I just realized there's something in the chat. Oh, thank you, Jessica. Yes, 2 p.m. Eastern next week, 2 to 4. Great, thank you. Right, so there's a couple of postdoc openings related to this this type of work. So there's a Uranus and Neptune one, and then there's sort of more atmosphere and ionosphere, and then right, and Jason Hofgardner asked me to sort of plug his new paper on Triton plumes, and so he's going to be giving a talk in a couple months. I want to say June or July. I think it'll be on our website. But I think he's giving a talk in a couple months over his paper. But I did promise that I would kind of plug those and make sure that people saw that paper. So and then please feel free to email me. My email is on the webpage. And if you have something, if you have something that you'd like to share, a paper, a postdoc position opening, or a faculty position opening, anything like that, or just a meeting that you're involved in and you're hosting. Feel free to email it to me, and I'll add it to the next month's community news. So I'll go ahead and copy paste these into the chat so that everyone can click the links, and hopefully it transfers correctly. I think usually when I do this, it seems to be okay. It's a little squished, but it's all there. And so I'll leave this Zoom open for you to be able to click on links and whatnot. But I will stop the recording now. And thank you so much, Mandy, for an excellent presentation. And hopefully I'll see you all next month.
Thank you.
I feel like I should know how to pause a recording. Stop recording. There we go.